That's the Beatles in 1964 on The Ed Sullivan Show. It was more a national event than a guest appearance.
The Beatles are one of the most iconic bands in music history, with a legacy that continues to captivate fans around the world. But despite their fame, there are secrets about the band that most fans don't know. Secrets that were carefully kept hidden for years. Among those secrets are rare, never-before-seen photos of the Beatles. Pictures so elusive that even the most dedicated fans had no idea they existed. How did the Beatles manage to keep these photos out of the public eye for so long? And why were they so determined to keep them a secret? Some say the photos reveal a side of the band that could have changed everything, even their future. Join us as we dive into the mystery behind these hidden Beatles photos and uncover the untold story of how and why they were kept under wraps. The emergence of the Beatles. The Amazing Four, named John, Paul, George, and Ringo, were a group of young, innocent, and talented musicians from the city of Liverpool, England, who didn't just play music, but also totally rejuvenated rock and roll and youth culture itself. Right from 1962, when Ringo joined John, Paul, and George, until their sad split in 1970, the Beatles became the shining source of inspiration and hope for the generation of the 1960s. To start the exciting story, a 16-year-old John Lennon in 1956 started a casual group with some friends from Quarrybank High School in Liverpool. They called themselves the Quarrymen, which was inspired by their school song titled Quarrymen Old Before Our Birth. Furthermore, on the 6th of July, 1957, John met 15-year-old Paul McCartney, who didn't waste time to join as the rhythm guitarist. Then, in February 1958, Paul invited his friend, who was also 15 years old, George Harrison, to try out the band. George was impressed, so he auditioned and made a huge impression with his guitar skills, but John initially thought he was too young. However, after a month of persistence, consistency, and a second audition arranged by Paul, George played the lead guitar part of a song titled Raunchy, and this made them welcome him to the family as their lead guitarist. They kept recruiting people, and by January 1959, a lot of John's Quarrybank friends had moved on, and he started attending the Liverpool College of Art. The three guitarists, who now called themselves Johnny and the Moondogs, played rock and roll whenever they found a drummer. They also went by the name The Rainbows. Paul later shared with the press that the reason they picked that name was due to the fact that they all had different colored shirts and couldn't afford any others. That was to show how broke they were initially. A year later, John's art school friend Stuart Sutcliffe was lured to buy a bass guitar with the money he just got from selling his painting. He suggested they change their band name to the Beatles as a nod to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They kept that name until May, when they renamed themselves to the Silver Beatles and went on a short tour of Scotland as the backup band for a fellow Liverpudlian pop singer, Johnny Gentle. By early July, they had fully evolved into the Silver Beatles, and by mid-August, they became simply known as the Beatles. This was the story of the evolution of their name. Alan Williams became the Beatles' unofficial manager and did his best to set them up for a temporary residency in Hamburg. They then auditioned and brought on a young and talented drummer, Pete Best, in the middle of August 1960. Just 4 days later, the band, now a five-piece, left Liverpool for Hamburg and signed on for a 3.5-month gig with a well-known club owner, Bruno Koschmieder. Beatles historian Mark Lewisohn describes their arrival. They pulled into Hamburg at dusk on August 17th, right when the red light district was coming to life. Flashing neon lights advertised the various entertainment options, while scantily clad women sat in shop windows, ready for business. Over the next 2 years, the Beatles spent some time in Hamburg, using Preludin to keep their energy up during their all-night performances. After the Beatles ended their second round of performances in Hamburg, they started gaining more fans in Liverpool due to the rising Merseybeat scene. However, they started feeling stressed out from playing the same clubs several nights on the go. In November 1961, while they were performing at the Cavern Club, they crossed paths with Brian Epstein, who was a local record store owner and music enthusiast. He later expressed his happiness about the group, saying that he instantly liked what he heard, and describing how fresh, honest, and charismatic they were. Brian finally saw more than enough reasons to pursue the band for the next few months, and by January 1962, they trusted him enough to make him their manager. Throughout the next year, he worked so hard to get them out of their contract with Bert Kempfert Productions. He eventually got them a life-changing opportunity with a really good musician and producer. They initially got rejected, but just 3 months later, a better producer, George Martin, signed the Beatles to EMI's Parlophone label. George's first recording session with the Beatles happened at EMI Recording Studios, now popularly known as Abbey Road Studios, on the 6th of June, 1962. Right off the bat, he had some worries about Pete Best's drumming and told Brian that they should consider bringing in another drummer. Brian was already ecstatic over the idea of replacing Pete, so months later, they welcomed Ringo Starr, who left his band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, to join the Fab Four. By the end of the year, the Beatles finished their 5th and final stint in Hamburg, and by 1963, they decided that all 4 members would share vocal duties on their albums, including the drummer, who had a limited range, in order to ensure he felt part of the team. John and Paul were the main songwriting duo, but as the band's fame skyrocketed, it left the rest of them with fewer chances to take the lead on vocals. To help the Beatles make the most of their potential, George pushed them to act more professionally during the performances. John happily recalled George saying something like, "If you want to play bigger venues, you need to clean up your act. No eating on stage, no swearing, and definitely no smoking." From such humble beginnings, who would have imagined that they would team up to form one of the greatest groups of all time? It was a great journey indeed, but how did they get the big break that made them superstars? The thriving career. The story continues during the chilly months of winter and spring in 1963, when the Beatles began the actual journey to stardom in England. They were bringing out amazing original songs and jamming to classic American rock and roll on various BBC radio shows. Initially, their charm captivated young music lovers in Britain, but soon enough, their infectious energy broke through the usual barriers of taste, class, and age, turning their music and live gigs into hot topics of conversation everywhere. When they finally made their way to British television, the light they sparked was so intense that newspapers called it Beatlemania. Then, in early 1964, after a lot of excitement on American TV, that same mania exploded across the US, leading to a hot wave of British bands trying to capture that Beatle magic. Beatlemania was something very unique back then. Very often, the only musician that could come close to giving that level of excitement in the past was Franz Liszt. But that was before the age of mass media, which was capable of amplifying such fervor and excitement to a collective level. By summer 1964, when the Beatles starred in A Hard Day's Night, a movie which explored their newfound fame, their influence was known round the world. In fact, just like people started imitating Michael Jackson's hair and trousers, young people everywhere started imitating their iconic long hair, cheeky humor, and carefree spirit. Even those in the upper echelons of politics couldn't ignore the impact, so all 4 Beatles were awarded the title of Members of the Order of the British Empire by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, despite some grumbling from previous honorees who felt it cheapened the honor. Between 1965 and 1967, their sound transformed at a rapid pace, becoming more complex and varied. But in 1966, the Beatles stepped back from live performances to fully embrace the possibilities of the recording studio. This creative surge started the next year with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that young people around the world hailed as proof of the band's intelligence and the hopeful spirit of the era. They transcended the role of just musicians. For millions of young listeners, the Beatles symbolized the joys of a new counterculture, marked by hedonism and bold exploration, both in music and life. During these years, members of the band experimented with mind-expanding substances like LSD and delved into spiritual practices such as transcendental meditation, taught to them by the charismatic guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Throughout their heyday, the Beatles restructured rock and roll, giving it a somewhat cultural movement. The American artists they admired, like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, the Everly Brothers, and Buddy Holly, as well as other influential songwriters like Jerry Lieber, Mike Stoller, and Smokey Robinson, became unique sources of inspiration for them, and they in turn offered classical models for upcoming rock musicians. Meanwhile, the original songs they crafted dramatically broadened the musical landscape and expressive potential of the genre they inherited. Their great vocal harmonies, well-structured arrangements, and brilliant production techniques set new amazing standards for beauty and excellence in rock music. Immediately after the beginning of student protest movements in countries like Mexico and France, the Beatles thought about surrendering their role as de facto leaders of an inchoate global youth culture. However, they continued for many years to record and release new music and maintained a higher level of fame that couldn't be completed before or since. That same year, they officially launched their own record label, Apple, with the hope to take good care of experimental pop art. The band continued to be the talk of the whole world and enjoyed widespread popularity. The following year, Abbey Road became one of the band's best-selling and most loved albums. Now, we've seen how intimate they were as a group, and it begs the question, how did they fall out so spectacularly that they were forced to break up? Challenges leading to the breakup of the Beatles. These obvious challenges seem to start on the 10th of April, 1970, when Paul dropped important news in a press release about his debut solo album, McCartney, saying he was leaving the Beatles. This decision left his bandmates shocked, especially due to the fact that the Beatles were a perfect example of the spirit of togetherness during a transformative time. So the question was how they could break apart. Few people started realizing the tensions brewing beneath the surface. The dynamics of the group have been lowered since their manager, Brian, passed away in August 1967. Paul's album interestingly hit the popular radio stations, and when a cheeky interviewer asked if he would be working on anything new with the Beatles, he simply answered, no. However, he didn't say for certain if this meant a permanent separation. However, the Daily Mirror seized the moment, boldly declaring that Paul quits the Beatles. The rest of the band was so concerned that this news could hurt their sales, so one of them went to Paul's home to make peace, and hoping he could convince Paul to hold off on releasing his solo work until after the Beatles' Let It Be album and film comes out in. But, as expected, things didn't go as planned as Ringo found himself being thrown off McCartney's doorstep. John, who had actually been active outside the band for several months, expressed how betrayed he was. Let's take a walk back to September. Right after the band dropped Abbey Road, John Lennon had a heart-to-heart conversation with his bandmates, asking for a divorce. They tried all they could to talk him out of going public, wanting to keep things smooth during some tricky contract talks. But clearly, John was ready to break free. He had already rocked out at the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival with his Plastic Ono band that same month. Then, he took the stage on the British TV show Top of the Pops to perform his first solo track, Instant Karma, while Yoko Ono sat behind him, knitting away with a sanitary napkin over her eyes. Later on, John started embracing his solo artist vibe more and more. But Paul was not about to be left behind, so he decided to release his own album, which was self-titled, thereby getting his announcement out first and taking charge of the narrative and its timing, and obviously leaving the other three trying to keep their personal and corporate plans under wraps while new music hit the shelves. This public clash was just the tip of the iceberg, as somehow they started revealing deeper rifts beneath the band's happy face. The Beatles had been wrestling with issues of creative control and the idea of hitting the road again. Back in January 1969, they had started a project called Get Back, aiming to create a more stripped-down sound without all the bells and whistles of studio effects. But as they shifted their focus to the new album Abbey Road, that initial concept got pushed aside. When 1970 went on, fans were glued to their screens, watching the Let It Be movie unfold. It showed the legendary Beatles in a bit of a misunderstanding, sulking over song arrangements and passing the time with old tunes. But it all wrapped up with a bang. The iconic rooftop concert where they played Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and a lively One After 909. The album, which hit shelves on May 8th, did pretty well and gave us two memorable singles, the title track and The Long and Winding Road. Unfortunately, that was the last time the four of them recorded together. Fans held on to a little hope that one day the separated Beatles might reunite and recapture the magic that had captivated audiences for 7 years. However, this feud got to its peak in 1974 when Paul and John teamed up for a recording session in LA with the amazing Stevie Wonder. Although they all collaborated on each other's solo projects, they never managed to get back in the studio together again. Fans and critics chased every sliver of hope for the next Beatles, but few came close to recreating the band's magic. There were prospects. First, bands like Three Dog Night, the Flaming Groovies, Big Star, and the Raspberries. Later, Cheap Trick, the Romantics, and the Knack. But these groups only aimed at the same heights the Beatles had conquered, and none sported the kind of songwriting ability, vocal range, or intimate chemistry of the Liverpool Quartet. We've lived in the world without the Beatles ever since, and the music industry has felt their separation intensely. After the breakup, in 1970, the four members of the Beatles ventured into solo careers, successfully releasing their own albums. On occasions, they collaborated on these projects. For instance, Ringo's 1973 album, Ringo, was the only one that featured contributions from all four of them, even though they actually sang on different tracks. It's also worthy of note that, in August 1971, Harrison organized a concert for Bangladesh in New York City, with Starr joining him for the event. Apart from a jam session in 1974 that later got referred to as a toot and a snore, in '74, John and Paul never teamed up in the studio again. The legacy and music of the Beatles were also capitalized on in other ways, most times without their consent. In April 1974, a composition titled John, Paul, George, and Bert was done in London, featuring 11 songs that John and Paul collaborated to sing, and Harrison's hit titled Here Comes the Sun. However, Harrison later pulled his approval due to dissatisfaction with how his song was used. That same year, the off-Broadway production Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the Road hit the stage. A unique film, All This and World War II, produced in 1976, had a combination of Beatles covers from artists like Elton John and the London Symphony Orchestra. In early 1977, the unauthorized Broadway musical Beatlemania launched, becoming a hit and spawning several touring versions. However, in 1979, the band took some legal action against its producers, which resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement. Some years earlier, everyone was buzzing about the Beatles, and rumors of a reunion floated around. And then a few wealthy entrepreneurs tried to cash in on the nostalgic feeling. It started with a promoter named Bill Sargent in 1974, with a jaw-dropping offer of $10 million for a reunion concert. That wasn't all from him, though. In January 1976, he increased the amount to $30 million, and just a month later, it skyrocketed to $50 million. Then, in a hilarious twist of events, during a live broadcast of Saturday Night Live, a producer named Lorne Michaels jokingly tossed out an offer of $3,000 for the Beatles to appear. Little did he know that John and Paul were watching from John's apartment at the Dakota, just a short drive from the NBC studio. They even toyed with the idea of surprising Lorne by showing up, but immediately decided against it. After 4 years of going back and forth, tragedy struck heavily. An obsessed fan named Mark David Chapman shot John, and in the middle of this heartbreak, George honored his friend by rewriting lyrics to All Those Years Ago, which featured Ringo Starr on drums and backing vocals from Paul and Linda McCartney. This single eventually hit the massive airways in 1981. Paul also paid tribute with a track titled Here Today from his Tug of War album released in April 1982. Then 1987 came, the year the Beatles' studio albums finally made their debut on CD, thanks to EMI and Apple Corps. They then standardized the whole catalog by showcasing the 12 original UK albums along with the US version of Magical Mystery Tour. All the leftover singles and EPs that didn't make it onto those albums were bundled into a 2-volume set called Past Masters in 1988. Interestingly, apart from the beloved Red and Blue albums, EMI decided to cut most of its other Beatles compilations from the catalog, including the Hollywood Bowl record. In 1988, the Beatles made a huge achievement by being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their very first year of eligibility. On this occasion, George and Ringo were there, accompanied by John's wife, Yoko Ono, and his sons, Julian and Sean. Paul McCartney, however, chose to skip the event, feeling that the unresolved business differences with the others would make it awkward to fake a happy reunion. The following year, after a long legal battle over royalties, EMI Capital finally settled with the band, paving the way for some exciting releases of previously unheard material. Then, in 1994, when Live at the BBC got to the radio stations, it was the first official release of unreleased Beatles performances in 17 years. That same year, Paul, George, and Ringo teamed up for the Anthology project, which had actually been in the works since 1970. Between 1995 and 1996, the Anthology blossomed, and this project gave room for the band to narrate their own story, featuring several previously unreleased tracks. Alongside producer Jeff Lynne, Paul, George, and Ringo even added new parts to some of John's old demos from the late 70s. This creative endeavor led to the release of 2 new Beatles singles, Free as a Bird and Real Love. They also tried to work on a third demo, Now and Then, but it was ultimately shelved due to its poor quality. The anthology releases were a hit, with the miniseries drawing in about 400 million viewers. In October 2000, they published a companion book titled The Beatles Anthology. Then, in 1999, to celebrate the re-release of the beloved 1968 movie titled Yellow Submarine, they put out another album titled Yellow Submarine Songtrack. The Beatles had a bit of a difficult road pertaining to signing deals with online music platforms, primarily due to a long-standing royalty dispute. This tension was a result of Apple Corps' ongoing feud with Apple Inc., the owners of iTunes, over the use of the name Apple. In 2008, Paul revealed that the biggest hurdle to getting the Beatles' music online was EMI's demands, which they weren't willing to meet. Finally, in 2010, the band's entire collection of 13 studio albums, along with the Past Masters and the popular Red and Blue Greatest Hits compilations, became available on iTunes. Fast forward to 2012, when the Universal Music Group bought EMI's recorded music division, the European Union inquired of EMI to sell off some assets, including Parlophone. However, Universal retained the rights to the Beatles' music, which is still managed by Capitol Records. That same year, the complete Beatles album collection was also re-released on vinyl, either individually or as a complete box set. In 2013, fans saw the arrival of a second volume of BBC recordings titled On Air. live at the BBC Volume 2. Later that December, another batch of 59 Beatles recordings dropped on iTunes. This collection, called the Beatles Bootleg Recordings 1963, was strategically released before the end of the year to secure a 70-year copyright extension. Apple Records put it out on the 17th of December in order to prevent it from entering the public domain, but they took it down from iTunes the same day. Reactions from fans were mixed. As one blogger noted, serious collectors probably already had these tracks in their collections. In 2014, Paul and Ringo collaborated at the 56th Annual Grammy Awards at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. The next day, they filmed a special called The Night That Changed America, a Grammy salute to the Beatles at the Los Angeles Convention Center. This homage aired on the 9th of February, exactly 50 years after the Beatles made their iconic first U.S. TV appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. The special was a mix of performances by both Paul and Ringo, alongside modern artists that were covering Beatles classics, archival footage, and interviews with the two surviving members, conducted by David Letterman at the Ed Sullivan Theater. Then in September 2016, the documentary The Beatles, 8 Days a Week, directed by Ron Howard, hit the theaters. It captured the band's journey from their early days at the Cavern Club in Liverpool to their final concert in San Francisco, covering the years 1961 to 1966. The film premiered in the UK and US on the 15th of September and started streaming on Hulu just 2 days later. It garnered several accolades, including nominations for Best Documentary at the British Academy Film Awards and for Outstanding Documentary or Nonfiction Special at the Emmy Awards. To celebrate, an expanded and remixed version of The Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl was also released on the 9th of September. In 2017, Sirius XM Radio created a station named The Beatles Channel, and this allowed die-hard fans to tune in around the clock. Shortly after, to mark the 50th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a new edition featuring fresh stereo mixes and previously unreleased tracks was launched. This trend continued with special box sets for the Beatles in November 2018 and Abbey Road in September 2019. Remarkably, during the first week of October 2019, it topped the UK Albums Chart once again, 50 years after its original release, setting a new world record for the longest gap between chart-topping moments for an album. Moving to 2021, something very special popped up on Disney Plus called The Beatles, Get Back, a 3-part documentary directed by Peter Jackson. It was not just any old footage, it was the behind-the-scenes magic captured during the making of the Let It Be film. To set the stage, a book with the same title dropped a few weeks earlier on the 12th of October, and on the 15th, fans got their hands on a super deluxe version of the Let It Be album. Then, the next year, we saw the release of Get Back, Rooftop Performance, featuring legendary mixes of the Beatles' iconic rooftop concert, and available for streaming everywhere. Then in 2022, Paul and Ringo sang alongside Dolly Parton, Peter Frampton, and Mick Fleetwood for an unforgettable rendition of Let It Be, which made it first on Dolly's album titled Rockstar in November 2023. That same month, a special edition of Revolver came out, showcasing unreleased demos, studio outtakes, and even a new stereo remix, thanks to some groundbreaking AI tech from Jackson's Wingnut Films, which had been instrumental in the Get Back documentary. Plus, new music videos rolled out for Here, There, and Everywhere and I'm Only Sleeping, the latter getting a Grammy for Best Music Video at the 66th Annual Grammy Awards. In June 2023, Paul spurred up excitement by announcing plans for the final Beatles record. Using Peter's mixing, they would revive a demo from John's solo days. By October, that song was released to be Now and Then, set for release on the 2nd of November 2023. The following day, the official music video dropped and went viral, racking up over 8 million views in just 12 hours. It quickly rushed into the Spotify charts, becoming one of the most streamed tracks, and made waves as it debuted across various radio formats, breaking records for the most stations simulcasting a single song. It also marked their first UK #1 since 1999. Finally, on the 8th of May, 2024, their fans were happy to get treated to another version of the 1970 film Let It Be, which was also created by Peter's team, hitting Disney Plus and marking its first public appearance since it was officially released. The Beatles still thrived after their breakup, and this series of collaborative efforts made fans excited and even increased their fan base. Given the drama that led to their breakup, it's no wonder that the Beatles were eager to keep these photos hidden for as long as they did. The hidden photos and the reason they were kept hidden. Talking about the rare photos that were seen, they revealed their unbreakable bond in the 1960s and how it made people fall more in love with them. Their bond shows in those pictures, showing how they connect on stage and behind the scenes. The photographers took some of those photos when they were on tours and in rehearsals, typically showing how they had a huge sense of connection and intimacy. These photos didn't show any form of clash that they had underground. Instead, fans got attracted to them due to their amazing connection. Little did they know that the Beatles were facing a lot of issues that were discussed earlier. There were photos of the Beatles in outings like get-togethers and even concerts, showing love and commitment to each other. Some of these photographers took a picture in 1968 during a tour in London. In that particular picture, they looked so happy working with each other. On the 28th of July, 1968, they decided to take a break from recording the White Album for a casual photo shoot with popular photographers such as Stephen Goldblatt and Don McCullin. Surprisingly, the chosen day of the photo shoot became popular with the name Mad Day Out. In addition, they visited many amazing spots around London, including Thompson House, Wapping Pier Head, St. Pancras, and Old Street Station. Due to this photo shoot, Stephen later became a well-known director of photography in Hollywood, but his photos from that day ended up sitting in a drawer for years until Photovision unearthed and revealed them, collating them in a book. This is one of the many photographers who took their time to take pictures of the Beatles, revealing their unusual bond. What do you think about the split and subsequent collaboration of the Beatles after their breakup? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. To enjoy more exciting videos, click play on the video on your screen. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when a new video drops.